I think we can go ahead and get started. We have one completion seminar today, so it is, just want to remind everybody that we have an outside speaker joining us next week for a talk about salacious fish sex. 26th of April, so that's Wednesday at 4 p.m. Dr. Chuck Mandagen is a visitor with the co-op unit. If you are interested in talking with him, there are several activities planned. There's time set aside for graduate students, as well as socials and dinners during the evening. And speak with Kate in 202 if you want to get on the list for any of those activities. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Brandon White, who is giving us his completion seminar today. Brandon is a student of Mike Brown's, and he will be telling us about evaluation of nitrogen supplementation and processed soy fractions on the performance of cultured fishes.
All right, thank you. Yeah, as you said, my name is Brandon White, and I'm here to talk to you today about my nitrogen and processed soy fractions work. Currently, our global population is nearing 7.5 billion people, and it has been increasing at an annual rate of 1.6%. Coupled with that, per capita consumption of seafood has also been increasing. In the 1960s, per capita consumption of seafood was on average about 9.9 kilograms per year, and recently that number is nearly doubled, and it is now up to 19.2 kilograms per year. So due to this increased population, as well as the increased per capita consumption, we have turned to the oceans, turned to our marine resources to try to meet this demand in seafood consumption. And as you can see here, depicted by this graph on the right, it has resulted in the overexploitation of our marine fisheries, and now roughly 91% of our marine fisheries are fully fished or overfished at biologically unsustainable levels. So we have turned to aquaculture in an attempt to fill the supply and demand gap that our marine sources can no longer provide us. Global capture production, as you can see depicted by the orange here on the right, peaked in 1996 and has since plateaued. Meanwhile, aquaculture has been expanding at an annual rate of 6.2%, and it now produces roughly 67 million metric tons of food fish each year. So, fish that are farm raised through the practice of aquaculture are fed a pelleted diet. The traditional protein source of these pelleted diets was fish meal. Fish meal is just fish that's been taken, dried, oil extracted, and processed into a fine powder. And so it's not very sustainable to take fish, to feed fish when we're running out of fish. So it has resulted in an unstable supply and a highly variable market. As you can see, denoted by this dark blue line on the top, this is the 30-plus year average of the fish meal market. So this has driven researchers to begin to find alternative plant-based protein sources to replace fish meal with. One of these plant-based protein sources that may be a viable solution is soybean meal. Soybeans are grown here locally, and we have a much more stable supply, resulting in a much more favorable market, as you can see denoted by the orange line here on the graph on the right. So the thing about soybeans is that we can't just take soybeans right from the field and put them into these aquafeeds and expect fish to just eat them and grow. There are many processing steps that need to occur first before we put these into the feeds. So the first step, once the soybeans come in out of the fields, is a dehulling process where we separate the hulls, and what is remaining is called the full-fat white flakes. Then either a mechanical or a solvent hexane extraction process occurs to extract the oil from the full-fat white flakes, and then what we have from that remaining is the defatted white flakes. And then several things can happen to that, either grinding, toasting, or further processing to produce soy isolate, soy flour, soybean meal, or soy protein concentrate. The thing that we are primarily interested in is the soybean meal. From that, we can take the soybean meal and produce bioprocessed soy protein through a conversion process. So a little more on the bioprocessing side of it. We take the soybean meal to put it into bioreactors that are similar to these pictured here, and then with that we can run a conversion process with a microbe called Arabicidium poluens. So through this conversion process we have a few main goals we're looking to accomplish. One of those primarily is reducing anti-nutritional factors. Some of the anti-nutritional factors in soybean meal include phytic acid, trypsin inhibitors, non-starch polysaccharides, things like that may inhibit the growth of the fish when we, if we didn't process it, it would inhibit the growth of the fish when we put them into the diets. Another thing we are looking to do during the conversion process is to improve the essential amino acid profile relative to the essential amino acid profile of fish meal. Two limiting essential amino acids in soybean meal are often methionine and lysine that the fish need that raw soybean meal doesn't provide to them. So conversion gives us the opportunity to improve those profiles. We also improve palatability and digestibility of the ingredient, and consequently we increase the crude protein levels by freeing up some more of that digestible protein in the soybean meal. So once we produce these bioconverted products, we need to test them. The way we go about testing them is we formulate them into these aquafeeds and then we run trials. We have three main trials that we run. They're palatability, digestibility, and growth trials. The first of these trials that I have pictured up here is the palatability trial. Palatability trial is a relatively short-term trial. It's a 14-day trial with a 5-day pretrial period. All this 5-day pretrial period is when we offer the same ration of the fish meal control diet to all the fish, so they're on the same page before we switch them over into their respective experimental diets. Once we switch them over to start the 14-day trial period, we are feeding them 3 times a day in excess of satiation. And then after a given time, we go back through to collect the uneaten pellets and count them to quantify consumption. By doing that, we can evaluate their consumption relative to their body weight, and we can see how well they consumed each diet. The palatability trials are run in a 30-tank recirculating aquaculture system, just like the one I have pictured here. This is a 30-tank system with 30-gallon tanks. The second trial I mentioned was digestibility trials. We run digestibility trials and able to measure the ability of the fish to absorb the nutrients from the feed via a tracer method. The tracer we use is chromic oxide. Chromic oxide is a green substance that we include into the diets at a 1% inclusion level. And then we feed the fish twice a day to apparent satiation for 10 days. At the end of those 10 days, we collect the fecal material, dry it down, and then we're able to run analysis on it to find the apparent digestibility coefficients of protein to see how well that they digested the protein in the ingredient. These trials are run in a similar system. This is a 8-tank system. Same idea, but the tanks are larger, so we can get a higher quantity of fish in there and larger fish, so we can ensure that we have a large enough sample size at the conclusion of the trial. The final trial that I'll talk to you about today are our growth trials. These are our primary trials. They're a much longer term trial than the palatability trial that was 14 days, digestibility was 10 days. These trials are 105-day trials. We again feed the fish apparent satiation 3 times per day throughout the trial, and at 3-week intervals we take mass measurements. Mass measurements include individual lengths and weights on all of the fish, as well as group weights, tank weights, so we can monitor growth such as weight gain, Fulton's condition factor, specific growth rate, relative growth, and feed conversion rate. Upon completion of the trial, we take a subsample of 3 fish from from each tank, and from those we can sample livers, spleens, total viscera, and fat and fillet weights in order to get these health indices, SSI, HSI, VSI, and the fat and fillet yield. After we gather all the lengths, weights at the end of the trial, and we get the weights of all of our organosomatics, we run statistics on it, Shapiro-Wilk normality tests, also testing for unequal variances with the Levine's test. Any non-normal data is either transformed or run with a non-parametric Kruskal-Wallis test with an a priori level of alpha equals 0.05. All normal data, we run analysis of variance and any significant differences. We have post hoc multiple comparisons, 2-key HSD. So I went into depth a little bit on the palatability, digestibility, and growth trial, what they are, and these were the actual controlled experiments that I ran for each of those type of trials. So the first set we have here are the palatability trials. These are 2 nitrogen trials that we ran where we supplemented nitrogen sources and nitrogen concentration post-conversion into these aqua feeds. Both of these trials were run on rainbow trout, and for the first trial we used diammonium phosphate, ammonium chloride, and urea at 1250 part per million inclusion based on the nitrogen portion of those compounds. The idea behind this was to see if there was a palatant effect on any of these sources, to see if they didn't like one source, or they liked one source better than the other, or basically to see if any one of them absolutely did not agree with the palatability of the fish. So we tested that in hopes to find a source that we could potentially supplement to the microbe, the Arabicidium polylen, during conversion, so it won't be nitrogen limiting. If it would happen to be nitrogen limiting, we would run the risk of the microbe using up some of the protein already present in the soybean meal, and we want to increase the protein levels, and so we don't want to lose any of that protein that's already present. After the nitrogen source trial, we followed up with the nitrogen concentration on urea, where we tested up to 2,000 part per million inclusion against a 0 part per million inclusion to see if we have a sort of a peak or a plateau where palatability drops off after a certain inclusion point. A second portion of the trials we called the soy fraction trials. We ran a digestibility trial on hybrid striped bass and 2 growth trials on hybrid striped bass and rainbow trout. What we called these soy fraction trials were these 6 experimental soy ingredients that we have listed over here. All 6 of these were converted during the conversion process in the bioreactor that I showed you previously with Arabicidium polylen. And just kind of a background on these 6 diets that we'll be looking at here next and the results of them. If you look at the ES6 here, this is our base soy conversion process. This is a converted product. And then as we move up from there, we have ES5, which is that base soy plus an extra wash step. And these first 4 are fractions of our processing. So as we're producing this meal and bioconverting this, we have various centrifugation and fermentation steps, and we've pulled out different fractions of that to include into these aqua feeds. So we have no cells added back of the A pole cells, cell cream, whole cell broth, and then diet 4 was an enzyme inclusion for replacement of the A pole cells being added back. So the first trials that I mentioned there were the palatability trials. These were the nitrogen source and concentration trials. So as you can see here on the left, this was the first trial, the source, where we tested all of the different sources. We didn't find any significant differences in consumption in either one of these trials, but as you can see, there was certainly a trend towards urea, where we had slight increased consumption, where we figured we should investigate that slightly more, and that's when we moved into the concentration trial here on the right. And so we had the ES control was experimental soy control with no nitrogen supplementation, as compared with 500, 1,000, 1,500, and 2,000 parts per million. The way we were looking at that was to see if we had any major drop off in consumption, but we found no significant differences, indicating that we could supplement the microbe with up to 2,000 parts per million of urea without any palatable effects. The next trial was digestibility. This was with hybrid striped bass, and we took the first 5 experimental soy ingredients that I had on that previous list against a raw soybean meal negative control and a fish meal control diet. The way this graph is set up is it's change relative to the fish meal baseline over here, percent change. So we see that soy diets 1, 4, and 5 had higher protein digestibility than the fish meal, and diets 2, 3, and the soybean meal control had lower digestibility than the fish meal. So just to kind of point out here, this ES4, that was our enzyme inclusion, and the enzyme seemed to help out and break down some of those anti-nutritional factors that I mentioned earlier to make it a higher digestible product. And conversely, we had the soybean meal. This is just straight soybean meal, hasn't been bioprocessed. It's the negative control that we looked in, and you can clearly see that a lot of those ANFs are still present, and that is why digestibility suffered relative to the fish meal control. The last 2 trials that I'll talk about today are the longer term. These are our primary growth trials to assess growth. What we have here, I set up just a little bit of a Venn diagram to see how similar these trials were. They were both 105-day trials with the same 6 experimental soy ingredients tested against the fish meal control. The primary difference in both of them was species. One was rainbow trout, a cool water species, and the other was hybrid striped bass, the warm water species. So obviously water quality varied a little bit in both trials to meet their optimal water qualities. And the systems. Due to system availability, we were running these 2 trials at the same time, and we ended up running them in slightly different systems. The rainbow trout, we're running a 35 tank recirculating system with 190 liter, 50 gallon tanks, while the bass were running a 28 tank system with 114 liter tanks, which are roughly 30 gallon tanks. And due to the slight difference in systems, we had 4 replicate tanks with the bass, 5 replicate tanks with the trout, and we had 30 fish per tank with the trout and only 20 fish per tank with the bass, where we adjusted our stocking level so we wouldn't run into any inhibit growth due to any density dependent factors. Even though we had the same 6 experimental ingredients, we still had to formulate the diets based on the nutritional demands of the fish. So we had a diet composition of the rainbow trout with a crude protein level of 44% and 14% lipid, while the bass had a similar crude protein of 46% but only 8% lipid. So this is a lot of numbers here to look at. This is what the next 4 slides will look like, so just kind of bear with me here and don't try to study all these numbers and memorize them all. I just want to point out a few quick trends. So these are the performance metrics we looked at when we took individual lengths and weights of the fish, and then we took the group weights also for each tank. I have the experimental soy ingredients listed along the side against the fish meal control there on the bottom. And across the top we have gain per fish. That's how much each individual fish gained over the 105-day trial, as well as Fulton's condition factor, relative growth, specific growth rate, and feed conversion rate. As you see, the 4 right column, or the 4 left columns, excuse me, as denoted by the superscripts, we found no significant differences in these metrics, but on the feed conversion rate, there on the right side, experimental soy diet number 5 had a significantly higher FCR than the fish meal control. Not saying that the fish meal control really suffered. It was the lowest here, but these are still very good FCRs, especially when you compare them to other common livestock species such as cattle, where we're closer to a 5-to-1 ratio, where we'll put 5 pounds of feed and they can only produce 1 pound off of that 5 pounds. With these fish, we're much closer to that pound to pound, where even with the fish meal, we're only offering 1.27 pounds, and we can still get a pound of gain in return. The organosomatics, this was from the 3 fish we subsampled upon conclusion of the trial, where we pulled livers for the HSI, spleens for the SSI, and the total viscera weight for the VSI, as well as fat and fillet. for the trout trial here, again, for SSI, BSI, fat, and fillet, we found no significant differences. They're all pretty close there, around a 50% fillet yield based on the body weight, and around a 4% fat yield. The one difference that I would like to point out is in the HSI, when we sampled the livers, fish meal HSI was significantly greater than experimental soy number 2. On to the hybrid stripe bass trial, we found some pretty similar results as we found for the trout. And so again, we're looking at these same metrics. And as you notice across the top here, this is where diet number 1 really starts to stand out in terms of performance. We didn't find any significant differences in the gain per fish at the end of the trial, but you can see that Fulton's condition factor was significantly greater in ES1 as compared to the fish meal control. Relative growth and SGR were significantly greater in ES1 as compared to diet number 4, which was the enzyme inclusion diet, and that was mainly due to lack of consumption in ES4. And then our feed conversion rates, again, the fish meal was the poorest performing feed conversion rate as compared to all other experimental diets. Organosomatics, they look very similar to what we found in the trout, with no significant differences in those 4 columns on the right. But again, we find the hepatosomatic index, the liver indice, is significantly greater in the fish meal as compared to experimental diet number 3. So what does all this mean? I threw all these trial names at you and all these numbers and everything. Basically, what we're trying to get across, what we're trying to produce here, is we're trying to produce a highly digestible, higher protein, soy-based feed ingredient for aqua feeds. If we can get this to work, to put it into the aqua feeds, we can then start feeding these to fish, raising them through aquaculture, and providing a healthy and sustainable protein source to feed our growing population as we near and exceed 7.5 billion people. By doing this, we have hope that we should be able to improve the sustainability of the marine fish stocks and food webs, take some of that pressure off, where we don't have to keep going to get all of our fish from the oceans. And overall, we're just looking to contribute to the science of improving renewable natural resource utilization. So I'd like to thank my committee, Drs. Mike Brown, Bill Gibbons, Steve Chips, and Mike Barnes, as well as technical assistance from Tim Bruce, Tom Kasiga, Scott Sindelar, Dustin Schultz, and 2 great technicians I got to work with, Alex Sindelar and Ashton Fay. These trials, a lot of these, especially the growth trials, where we're 105 days, it's a lot of work, and it takes quite the team when you're feeding 3 times a day, 7 times a week, weekends, holidays. The fish wake up every morning and they're hungry, so somebody has to be there to feed them. I'd also like to thank funding sources: South Dakota Soy Research Promotion Council, United Soybean Board, South Dakota Ag Experiment Station, as well as the department, the university, and Prairie Aquatech for technical assistance and use of facilities. So at this time, I'd take any questions that you guys may have.
Did you measure the composition of fatty acids in fish, so omega-3 versus other fatty acids?
No, we didn't. We were mainly just looking at growth here. When we're looking at these soy fractions, those first 6 diets, we're basically just kind of fractionating that out to see, where to go with further studies, I guess. So all of this is a stepping stone from soybean meal up to our final product that we're looking for. So the main focus of this, I guess, was just growth, but yeah, that would definitely be something to look into as well.
Well, the other part of that is the liquid source is all fish oil, so that should have been fairly consistent in terms of the fatty acid profiles. So we held that constant all the time.
Yes, sir.
So if you look at your digestibility and then all the factors you looked at for growth performance using the fish meal as a control, I was trying to remember, but you get old, you can't remember all these things. What would be the best of your treatments if you combine digestibility and then the performance, your organosemetic
Sure.
characteristics,
I can back up to
E1
that.
through E4,
Yeah,
5?
when you're looking, I mean, we just had this digestibility trial was just on the bass, but obviously our enzyme inclusion looks really great when you look at our digestibility. But once we got into the growth trials, we found that there might have been something, I'm not sure if it had something to do with palatability, but consumption really fell out once we got to the growth trials. And that's where, when we get to some of these growth metrics, and especially the growth on the bass, when we looked at that, and those were significantly lower than Diet 1. Between both species, this Diet 1 was our leader, especially when we have the digestibility to compare to it. But Diet 1 and 2 were pretty consistent on both trials to be the leaders. I think it was, I can get to it here. Yeah, so this is where our diet.
And ES1 was, what was
This was
it?
the no cells inclusion. So of those 4 fractions that we had of the no cells, cell cream, whole cell broth, those were 1, 2, and 3, and 4 was the enzyme inclusion.
So it's just the base product,
Yep.
without cells added, without
cells,
extra cells
the base
added
product
to
with
it.
our washed cake.
Okay.
So.
So this is a two-part question. First part, why those 2 species? Why did you pick the hybrid striped bass and the trout?
It was basically their common culture species. We wanted to look at something that's readily available in our areas and something we can get. These trout actually came from spearfish from Lindstad, so we were easily able to get those. And then hybrid striped bass, they were our cool water species we wanted to look at. And then conversely, we also wanted to look at the warm water species, where the hybrid striped bass are a hardy fish, common culture species that's relatively easy to raise, and a lot of people do it. And I believe we got those from Keogh in Arkansas, so that's where the bass came from.
So then there were obvious differences between how the bass responded versus the trout. Any hypotheses as to why that might be?
I'm still kind of looking into that, I guess, looking into previous literature, and I mean, a lot of it, especially when you're looking at digestibility and the way they use these. I mean, I guess I don't really have any specific answers, but definitely it's based on their differences between how they utilize the nutrients, especially lipids and things like that. I noticed a few different things, like when we were doing these fat and fillet necropsies, it's really tedious work getting every little scrap of fat off there. And a lot of that's just how they come to be as warm water and cool water species. If that kind of answered that.
Yeah.
It's not a great answer. That's kind of my way of telling you, well, I kind of have an idea, but I need to dig into it more.
Yeah, their gut morphology and physiology are totally different, so we kind of reached out both ends of the spectrum with regard to the production species. Learn what we can.
Sorry, just realized that.
We didn't go with channel catfish simply because it's not really a high profile, I mean, it's a high profile species for the market, but the nutritional demands of that species are not quite what they are for hybrid.
Do you have any questions from the remote people? Looks like you might be getting a question. No. No.
Brandon, do cold water species typically have a higher feed conversion ratio than warm water species?
That's what we were finding here as far as that's gone there, I guess. But I mean, as far as feeding the trout, they were a lot of that feed conversion, and especially the way, yeah, there we go. This is the bass we're looking at here. Get that back up there. Okay, I'll filter back in here quick. The way for these growth trials especially, the way we monitored feed conversion was at the end of every day. So we had a container for each tank, and at the end of every day, then we would weigh the container and weigh the feed, so we would know how much feed throughout those 3 feedings each day they ate. Well, the way the feedings worked were we would feed them their floating diets, so all these pellets float on top of the water. We'd feed them, then we'd go back around every 10 minutes and keep feeding until there was pellets left floating over. Well, the like for the trout, this trout trial, the main reason I believe that these FCRs were so improved was when we left those pellets left floating over, when we'd come back for like the noon feeding, all those pellets were gone. They were all cleaned up. We had screens on all the drains. We weren't losing any feed out of that, but the trout would do an excellent job of coming to the surface and really cleaning up that feed in between every time. Every feeding, I should say. Whereas like the bass, they would on the initial feeding, they did a great job of coming to the surface and on that initial right away and cleaning it up. But I think on some of the FCRs, especially once we get to the bass FCR, and it was upwards of 1.93. A lot of that, what that kind of had to do too is, I believe the pellets, when we manufactured that diet, when they came off of the extruder, they didn't puff up quite as well as the soy diets did. So portions of that might have been a little more dense, and they may have sank quicker before we before we could see it. So as a result, I mean, our consumption those tanks may have been slightly overfed. We're still just going to apparent digestibility or apparent satiation, excuse me. Don't get me wrong, but I think some of that may be contributed to just kind of their feeding strategies and how the trout cleaned it off the surface right away, whereas the bass in some of these later trials, some of that feed may have they may not have cleaned it up as well, and that's where we begin to see this in the FCR.
So the feed, even though they didn't eat it, it would have been counted as eaten because it would have sank down.
And they did, yeah. Just especially on that fish meal, and I think that's what. And it wasn't like the whole diet was sinking.
Yeah.
There was just portions, especially when we sieved it out, that some of them were a little more dense, and so that it's something I definitely need to look into a little more. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, especially the trout, and that's where you're seeing improved FCRs on the trout. They come to the surface right away and really hammer that stuff. So.
All right, let's give Brandon one more round of applause. All right, thank you everyone. Remember, Chuck manages the seminar next week, Wednesday at 4 p.m.